Professor Magaly?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, clearly.
Okay, let me just check my video, okay? Just
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Pak Thomas, I think I can stop share my screen now, and Prof. Magaly can start her screen share.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Reddy.
Okay. Sorry, this is the program.
Yes, this is a program, of course.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see?
Yes, for your
Okay.
full screen.
Okay.
Very clear.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, can I stop just 1 second? I
Yeah.
forgot something important. Just
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll be back in a minute.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, for all participants, if you have any question, don't be hesitate to raise your hand, or if you have some problem with the language, you can type in the chat, and then I will tell to Professor Magaly. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I can start sharing my screen, right?
Yes. Yes, you can start.
Okay, so please give me the go ahead and I will start as soon as you let me.
Yeah, okay, because we already on our schedule time, you can proceed for your presentation.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank the geology department and especially Professor Najib and Professor Thomas for the invitation to give a guest lecture. So it's a great honor. And some of you may know that I have been collaborating with UNDIP for quite a long time, several years. So this is a wonderful opportunity to actually give a lecture on remote sensing, especially as applied to geology. And please feel free to interrupt me. Thomas, let me know if there's a question in the audience, no?
Yes.
So I will, sometimes I will stop just to check, okay? And
yes.
I believe I have, how much time do I have? Like 1 hour for the lecture?
Yeah, around that.
Or a little bit more, or?
Following for the schedule, you will have, yes, around 1.5 hours.
Oh, okay, good, excellent.
Yeah.
Because the reason I'm asking is that actually the lecture slides, I will probably cover this in an hour or maybe less, but I have, I hope it will work. I would like to give a demo, a live demo.
Yes, what nice.
And that's going to be an opportunity also to answer some questions from the audience, no, from the students.
Yes.
So feel free to interrupt me. Good.
Yeah. Okay.
So just briefly about myself, I'm a associate research professor in Boston University, and I work at the Center for Remote Sensing. And I'm a geologist by training, and so just do the slides. Oh, okay. And I have been involved in the remote sensing scientific community for a couple of decades now. So I did my PhD work using remote sensing, using satellite images, but back then they were not as sophisticated as they are nowadays. And what I intend to do in this presentation or in this guest lecture is to give you an overview of what this Earth observations systems, what they actually, what they are, what type of data they provide, and also talk a little bit about the history of remote sensing. It has really matured as a technology, but also as a research field. So it's by no way comparable to the times when I was a student, and analyzing visually these images. So here, this graph basically gives you the whole entire overview of the system, of the intent of this type of technique. So you got on the left side here basically an instrument. It's a measurement instrument, like many instruments you may be familiar with when you go to the field and take your soil samples or rock samples and so on, and you carry out in the field maybe some measurements, or in the lab, right? So it's basically an instrument, except that it's placed on a platform, and that platform can be a satellite. Doesn't have to be a satellite, could be an aircraft, could be a drone, could be even a truck, right? But it's being placed, the instrument is being placed away from the target or the material or the object it's actually observing. So that's why it's called remote sensing, from basically perceiving something, in this case energy, and remote because it's far away from the target. And the advantage of that is that you don't need to actually touch the target or the object, or it could be a land cover type or whatever, an ecosystem. You don't need to basically you have a way of observing something without touching it and without destroying it. And this measurement somehow is not ready for us to analyze, because it's just information. It's not even information, it's data collected by the sensor, and this data is basically different levels of energy radiation that arrives at the sensor, and it has to be converted into information, and that's what's shown here in the middle. Let me change my pointer, and you can see here how the derived information in this case is showing us a storm, a huge storm, probably a hurricane or a typhoon. And not only that, it's showing us the location of that, of course, of that storm, but it's actually giving us also a vertical profile of the storm. And the colors mean something. I don't have the legend here, but it basically shows you the structure of the storm, right? And you can imagine that this satellite, it's going to be a particular satellite called, to detect the precipitation, is not capable of delivering this satellite product. So this satellite product somehow had to be derived from many measurements. And this is done by applying some algorithms and so on. So it has to be processed. And eventually, this information, very detailed information about the hurricane or the typhoon, will allow the end user to assess the impact of flooding, right? So there are many, many steps from measuring at the satellite level down to deriving important information or information you're actually looking for, to applying that information for a specific purpose, either by mapping the extent of the flooding, or predicting or assessing the destructive force of that storm. Okay, so not surprisingly, remote sensing is being used in many fields, not only in earth sciences or geology, but atmospheric sciences and all kinds of fields. And here we have sort of summarized them in three main groups, but by no way this is the only type of applications you can find in remote sensing. There are many more. For example, what's not listed here is, for example, archaeologists. They also use remote sensing, but they use it actually to sort of map something that is not necessarily visible on the surface, on the ground, right? They're looking for ways of investigating an archaeological site that is buried. It's hidden. It's not visible on the surface, but there are certain type of radiation that allows, and I'm using now the word radiation, we will talk about this in a minute, that allows to view what's underneath. And in geology, the same. We, especially those who are interested in structures or in groundwater, it's requires a way of knowing what's in the subsurface, right? Basically detecting something that is not necessarily visible on the surface. And remote sensing, there are certain wavelengths that allow, that can penetrate the loose sediments, dry sediments, and then image what's underneath. So this list here is not complete, but in general, it basically summarizes the main fields. So air quality, for example, which requires measurements of the atmosphere and the different gases and so on. Water resources, including floods, but not only, also drought monitoring. And there we have the word monitoring, which implies that you're not only observing a phenomenon or an event at a given time, you're actually following the event over a time period. No? And this is one of the advantages of using an instrument that is constantly orbiting around the Earth and taking pictures. You have a way of monitoring certain phenomenon or processes that change over time. So dynamic processes, right? And the Earth is a very dynamic system. Some events are very short-lived. Some events evolve over a very, very long time. And we geologists know that we're used to think of processes that need, many thousands of years or millions of years to actually complete their, or evolve and complete their evolution. But with remote sensing, of course, we are limited to relatively short-lived or short intervals, right? And that's why you will see that this type of technology is used for those phenomenon that happened within, maybe a day, a month, a year, or maybe some decades, but not longer. And one of them is land use and land cover change, right? That's an important field in remote sensing. And indirectly, these aspects are being used by many disciplines: biology, archaeology, geology, even atmospheric science, and so on, right? So they're all somehow providing some information that can be used. In terms of geology, you can see that water resources is very important for those who are interested in in mapping and monitoring, for example, evapotranspiration. I'm a geologist who works a lot in arid environment, semi-arid environment, where they have a need for groundwater to irrigate the fields. So evapotranspiration is something we need to be capable of monitoring, because water is very scarce. There's not a lot of water, and you don't want to lose that water to the atmosphere. You want to use it for irrigation for your crops, right? So satellite observation of evapotranspiration is very, very important. I already mentioned that these satellite measurements, they do not provide immediately the maps that we need or the information that we need. They have to undergo a lot of what we call processing. And here we see a scheme. We see that the data collected by this instrument here needs to be compared to information collected in situ, surface measurement. Why? Because we need somehow to calibrate the information or the data that we collect here with actual observations, in situ observations in the field, where we can actually control how these measurements are being done and so on. So this could be, for example, a station that is measuring soil moisture, right? And we can not only measure the soil moisture, we can take a sample of the soil and take it to the lab and analyze it there in terms of type of soil and water content and so on. But when we do this, we usually try to coordinate this with satellite data observation. So we take a measurement here in situ when it's exactly at the same time when the satellite flies over it and takes what we call a reading, right? So then we end up with basically two observations, one in the field and one in the taken from space, and then we compare them. And not only that, we try to use a model, right, that uses data from the satellite and uses data from the field, right? And this model requires many parameters. It's usually a very complex model because the Earth system is very complex. And I don't know if you can see this very little sketch here, but basically what's showing here is we're looking at the interface of water, the ocean, the land, and the atmosphere. And all these systems, all these spheres, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere, they all somehow interact. It's a very dynamic system, and many exchanges, flux exchanges, or energy exchanges occur between all these spheres. And we use models to kind of try to understand what is happening when and where. And these models require measurements, actually, and we get them from satellites and from these in situ. So why is it that we are so interested in measuring what's happening, on our planet? We have been measuring rain, for example, for many years, and if you go back in history, in the human history, the archaeologists, they do that. They have found records of farmers, for example, taking a note whenever there is a rain event, or whenever there's a flooding and so on, because they need this water for irrigation, right? Or they take notes when the river water is dropping or rising. So in the human history, we all have been always taking notes and writing down the date when a certain event happens, because of course we need this information. We need to know how the seasons evolve, and especially farmers, because they need to predict how much crop they will be able to harvest that year. And if it doesn't rain, then it's a big problem. But so that requires observation, right, and recording. And we started actually doing it in a more systematic manner by using climatic stations. And you can see here in terms of years, that we started 150 years ago, actually more than 150, I would say almost we're close to 200 years ago, with measuring climatic parameters. But this picture here also shows that the distribution of these climatic stations is the distribution is very uneven. So with very dark colors, you can see those climatic stations that were placed 150 years ago, especially here in North America, here in Europe, and here in East Asia, mostly Japan and so on. And you can see in lighter colors, yellow, that it started maybe 70 or 50 years ago, or 100, no, sorry, 100 years ago, because 50 means 150, 100 years ago. And then in more blue colors, you can see, for example, if we go to Southeast Asia, that it started in relatively recent time, I mean, using this scale here. But not only that, so the length of station records, climatic station records, is, as I said, about nowadays about 200 years. This graph is a little bit old. But if you look at the number of stations, 7,000, right? All distributed around the world. But there are certain areas that are undersampled. And that is a problem for those researchers, for those scientists who are concerned about global phenomenon. They need a complete picture, right? For example, climate change scientists. It's not enough for the climate change scientists to have very detailed records of the climate in certain countries or continents. They need full coverage. And even they need even climate, climate data over the oceans. And you can see that there are not many measurement stations. Why? Because it's quite difficult to put, to have a platform, a stable or relatively stable platform in the middle of the ocean, equipped with many instruments. And also because you need to be able to maintain the instruments, and you have to have easy access to the instruments, and that's not possible, not so easy when you have them somewhere in the ocean, and also along the poles and desert areas. So this is why we are relying more and more on satellite observations, because they provide information where there are no ground-based measurements, or it's very hard to get a dense network of stations set up in those areas, very remote areas. And also the other problem with these measurement stations, and measurement stations is not limited to climate measurements. Could be taking measurements, I don't know, of seawater salinity or something else, right? The other problem with these measurements or stations, is that they need to be checked, they need to be maintained, right? And satellites have one advantage. They are placed on an orbit that is very much, how can I say, we're very stable. So the satellite is rotating around the globe in a relatively stable orbit. So the speed of the satellite is consistent. The altitude, everything is kind of stable. It's always the same, right? And it has a way to take measurements in a very consistent and repetitive way, right? So constantly it's tracing over the Earth, taking measurements. Of course, satellite are, are prone to failure, and sometimes these instruments, they fail, and then the satellite becomes no longer usable, But in general, they're, we call them workhorses. Workhorses means that, they do the job and they're really constantly doing the same thing, basically, and they provide global coverage. Now, ground-based measurements, they have an advantage over satellite-based measurements or even airborne measurements, in that we humans can actually go to the field and we can check that everything is working fine. And we can get very detailed information because we can also collect rocks or soil samples, take them to the lab, which is not possible if you rely on a satellite-borne or airborne or even a drone, because it's measuring something without touching it. So if you go to the field, you can actually touch, observe, measure, excavate. You have many ways of analyzing the plot, right? You get a lot of detailed information, so definitely. But sometimes that information is collected from different people, maybe in different countries, following different protocols. So the measurements done in one country and the other country, although you're looking at, similar measurements or similar, observations, they may not be compatible, right? So they're following one protocol here, in another continent, a different protocol. And so sometimes it's not uniform, whereas with satellites, it's usually a way of collecting information in a very uniform manner. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the hydrological or to the Earth system. And here's the hydrological cycle, just to show you how dynamic the Earth system is, and that it's important to analyze the different components in context. So you see here that what I was referring to in the previous slides, the interface between the ocean and the land, and of course the atmosphere. And it's a cycle because there's a flux of of energy, or yes, I would say energy going on. And if we look at the ocean, these are the important sources of moisture content in the atmosphere, through evaporation, where the winds will transport this moisture, and some of it may, depending on temperatures and pressures and so on, condensate and fall down as precipitation or rain, right? But some of them will end up inland and precipitate in the form of ice and snow and so on. But this water, which changes its face from being, sort of a vapor to liquid to snow, ice, and so on, finds its way back to the ocean, either as surface runoff or as groundwater or soil moisture, etc. But there's a lot of exchange going on in all these different bodies. Now, we have here the sun, and the sun is one of the most important sources of energy for remote sensing instruments. Because in order for us to not only take pictures of the ocean, of the land, of the mountains, the atmosphere, and so on, and in order for us to take measurements of the constituents, how the different Earth surface materials are made up, we need somehow a way of collecting that information, and we do that with sun radiation or electromagnetic radiation. So we use the sun as our energy source, right, to basically illuminate the Earth's surface. And these sun rays, they will interact with whatever material they encounter, whether it's in the atmosphere, for example, the clouds. Some sun radiation will be absorbed by the clouds and then re-emitted in a different wavelength. Some radiation will penetrate the clouds and then interact with the water, and some of it may be absorbed, reflected, or just continue through the water, and the same with land. So this is a very important concept in remote sensing. So as I said, it's an observation instrument, but of course it needs to observe something, right? And what it observes, what it measures is energy in the form of electromagnetic radiation. And it needs a source that generates this energy, and that's the sun, right? And so it's actually the cheapest form, or the less expensive form for us to generate or to take advantage of something that generates energy. And these instruments, they are basically collecting the reflected sunlight, right? And the reflected sunlight will then tell us something about the properties of the land or the water and its status, for example, vegetation. So reflected light, sunlight, tells us something about how densely vegetated an area is, and also the status of a forest. Is it, a healthy forest? Is it affected by some disease? And the same with crops. These are supposed to be crops, fields. So basically, we're using remote sensing, an instrument, to understand the flux of energy, right? You need energy to evaporate water. You need energy to transport those moisture or water vapor. And you need also, actually you release energy when precipitation happens, right? And so on. Okay, so this was sort of an overview of what remote sensing is. So here I'm summarizing why we use satellites and models. So it's important to know that these satellite instruments, they not only generate beautiful pictures, but actually more than that. They really provide data about properties of the land surface. No? And so they have the advantage of providing consistent global information in a repetitive way. They complement ground monitoring networks, including monitoring wells and all the instrumentation you put in a well. That's also part of ground monitoring networks. They're extremely important, and they're needed to calibrate and validate any information you gain from space. But they complement them and they provide information where there are no or not enough ground-based measurements, right? They are used to advance warning of something, disaster or something environmental event that is happening. We use them for monitoring and assessing damages after, you know, an earthquake, after a tsunami, a hurricane, and so on. And we use models together with these measurements because the models provide the parameters which are not directly observable. Remember that the big, huge storm cell that I was showing in the previous slide, where you could see the vertical structure of it. That's, of course, this information was obtained from measurements, but not only measurements, also together with models. And here are some examples. For example, 3D winds and water vapor movement in the atmosphere requires some modeling, not only observation. Models help us to understand processes associated with the cycling of water, but not only cycling of water, also carbon dioxide and many other, you know, environmental parameters. And they're important for climate change and forecasting studies. All right, so not surprisingly, many agencies, space agencies, have conceived very important missions. And usually these satellites, they're not randomly placed in orbit. It's not that NASA, for example, or JAXA, or whatever space agency decides, oh, I'm going to build a satellite system to carry out this type of measurement, and I'm going to launch it to space. And you know, no, everything is more or less, you know, very well thought through and usually coordinated. So we actually see that the satellites, they are built for a certain purpose, a certain type of measurement, whether they are mostly measuring the lithosphere, biosphere, or hydrosphere, or atmosphere. They have certain missions or goals, and they're placed in very specific orbits. The orbit plays a huge role in how these measurements are carried out. And not only that, usually these satellites, they take measurements in coordination with other satellites, right? And that's what we call a constellation of satellites. So they fly in formation, one after the other, right? And these series of satellites, they take measurements of this always the same area as they, you know, orbit around the Earth in maybe 15 minutes separation. So first, the first one flies over it, and then the next one 15 minutes later, and so on. Okay. And this is important because, as I said, the Earth is, as a system, very complex, and analyzing only one aspect of the Earth is not enough for us to understand very complex processes. No? So we need a way of integrating Earth observation by carrying out these instruments. And if you want, an example is when you go to the field, right, to do your field work, usually you carry more than just one instrument, right? You may carry with you the GPS to know where you are, right? And then you may, you know, when you take some samples, or you may want to analyze, you know, the sediment layers and how, you know, the stratigraphy and all that. You need more than one instrument, right? Usually. And the same with satellite. Okay. Now, I mentioned already that the fundamental aspect of remote sensing is the electromagnetic radiation. And this means it's an energy that the instrument is recording. And this energy, as you can see, has, covers the whole spectral solar spectrum, and it has also certain properties. So within the solar spectrum, basically this is the energy that the sun radiates. We humans can only see a very tiny portion of it, which is the visible light. It's a tiny portion of the whole solar spectrum. And you can see here the waves and how their wavelength changes. They become shorter here and they are longer here. And there's a relationship between the wavelength and the amount of energy those waves. Say it again, someone said something? All right. If you wanna, please interrupt me anytime if you wanna ask a question. Now, the shorter wavelengths, gamma and X-ray, they carry enormous amount of energy that is actually for us humans harmful. No, we cannot be exposed very long to gamma radiation or X-rays, right? And thankfully, the atmosphere protects us from these radiation coming from from space. But in remote sensing, we use not only visible light to take these pictures, we also use the non-visible portion of the spectrum because it contains a lot of information about the surface features. We cannot see it, but we have instruments, we can build instruments that can detect infrared radiation or thermal infrared and so on. You know? So in this graph, and this is by the way, here we have shorter on the right and longer waves on the left. And here's the opposite, shorter waves on the left and longer waves on the right, so inverted. So here we have also the x-axis showing the wavelength, and the y-axis is showing the radiation intensity of the sun. So this curve shows you how much radiation the sun basically emits. And you can see that the sun maximum radiation amount happens in the visible light, and not only in the visible light, it happens around the green wavelength. So most of the sun radiation happens in the green wavelength of the visible light, but it also provides some radiation in other regions. You know? And in remote sensing, we noticed that those non-visible light portions of the sun radiation, they contain, or they can be used to reveal a lot of information about, especially about rocks and minerals and so on. If you take a rock, any rock type, you look at it and you analyze the color, the grain size, maybe the texture and so on, right? So you use your own remote sensing, instruments, your eyes, to basically differentiate, the shape, the color, the texture, and so on, right? So can you imagine if your eyes would be able to detect also near infrared and far infrared and microwave and all those radiations that we cannot see, how much more information you would probably obtain from your rock sample or your soil sample? Because any material will interact with light in one way or the other, either by reflecting or absorbing or by being just transparent. And so this is what these systems exploit. So they know we have here the solar, radiation, with which is emitting along the spectrum, different wavelengths. And these satellites, they're recording only the reflected portion of it, right? Or emitted. The Earth, the Earth as a body also emits radiation, but not in the visible, of course, not in the visible light, region, but it emits radiation in the form of heat. And the best evidence for that are volcanoes. I mean, this is really something that we can, observe and feel. So when a volcano erupts and so on, you will not only see the ashes, the plume, the ash plume, but also the lava flowing out, and you will detect the enormous amount of heat that is being released by these volcanic eruptions. No? So basically, it's in a form of heat that the Earth emits radiation, and it's can be recorded in the thermal infrared. So we have sensors that are capable of, or they're built to detect reflected solar radiation that happens here in the visible and also near infrared. And then we have those that can detect thermal radiation, heat, no? And also microwave. It's another form. And each one of them will tell you a little bit about the land or the ocean or the Earth surface, how it interacted with the incoming solar radiation, because the sun actually heats up the Earth, right? All right. Yeah, what's important also to know is not only the different types of regions in the spectrum, but also some of them are more appropriate to detect certain types of surfaces. No? For example, we use visible and near infrared and so on for detecting snow, ice, clouds, vegetation, soil, rocks, and so on. Whereas, for example, for detecting greenhouse gases and also temperature, we use thermal radiation. And then, for example, for detecting soil moisture, also soil salinity, or ocean water salinity, and so on, water vapor, we tend to use microwave radiation. So each region in this along the spectrum is maybe more appropriate for detecting certain aspects of the surface materials. No? Also, I should say that these instruments, they are usually built to capture a certain type of radiation. So there is no single satellite that can detect all kinds of radiation. Usually they're quite sophisticated. No? Another thing I want to mention here is that microwave is a very particular type of radiation, and it's used, for example, in radar. Radar, you probably have heard about radar sensors. And those actually radar sensors, they generate their own source of radiation. They're called active satellite or active sensors. No, they don't rely on the sun. They have their own way of generating microwave radiation, and the same with LiDAR. So there are certain types of sensors that satellite instruments that generate their own radiation. No. And that's actually explained here. So in passive remote sensing, which is this case here, the satellite is only capturing whatever sun radiation comes back to the satellite. And in active remote sensing satellites, they have a way of generating the energy, illuminating the Earth, and then they capture what's coming back, the basically returning signal. But because they're generating their own radiation, you can control how much, what's the amount of radiation. You know, if you talk about microwave, you know, basically the radar pulses, you know, how much microwave radiation you're using to illuminate the Earth's surface and how much is coming back. You know? And yeah, these satellites, they are placed on specific orbits. In this case, it's a polar orbit. It means that the satellite is basically flying from north to south and then from south to north. But the Earth is also rotating, but in a different way, right? So the Earth is rotating from west to east. And those two movements are responsible for the fact that when the satellite, you know, finishes one orbit, the next time it will, fly over the Earth, the orbit is slightly shifted to the west. You see that? And then the next one, it's shifted to the west. It's not because the satellite is changing its orbit. It's because the Earth is rotating. And that ensures that eventually, after many, many orbits, you have full coverage of the entire world or globe. But back to these measurements, we are really after some qualitative, but also quantitative measurements. So satellite pictures, they give you a qualitative picture of the Earth, right? And you can use them to interpret visually landforms and the landscape, and then you trace, you know, your boundaries of certain landforms, you know, volcanoes and so on. But we can do more than that. These measurements also contain information about the energy reflected back to space after interacting with the surface material. And that interaction of the surface material with incoming light and how much light it reflects, that gives us a possibility of converting that into a geophysical quantity, whether it's temperature, land surface temperature, or sea surface temperature, whether it's basically the chlorophyll activity of the plant, whether it's certain minerals contained in the soil or in the rock. This information is indirectly obtained through analyzing the amount of energy reflected by that material. Okay, so this is what we are really interested in, retrieving geophysical quantities. I don't know, someone is painting here, so that's not me. All right, so this, how is that done? How can we retrieve, you know, how can we know the mineral composition of a rock or mineral composition of a soil just from taking a reading from a satellite? So in reality, you know, we look at the Earth's surface and we see a picture like this one here, and we see colors and shapes, and we make sense out of it. This may be a lake or something, and this seems to be a vegetated area, right? So we interpret the surroundings by looking at shapes, colors, and so on. But the sensor is taking also a picture in the same wavelength as we do, right? The visible light. But at the same time, it's also taking a reading in all the other non-visible wavelengths. And this fact that this sensor, hyperspectral sensor, can measure radiation coming from the whole spectrum, contains a lot of information about the material that is, shown here. And we call this, the third dimension. The third dimension is the spectral content of, each area being imaged. And this is shown here. So we're used to look at an image, and it's a two-dimensional map or two-dimensional picture, right? With X, Y coordinates and so on. And, and then we see features here and we interpret what they are. But the instrument is taking a picture, a two-dimensional picture, along a whole range of wavelengths. And each one of them is showing the same areas, right? But in a different wavelength. So we have a way of, pointing at the vegetated pixel or water pixel, and then get a reading of the spectral response pattern, meaning how the energy, the solar energy, is being reflected by the vegetated pixel, by the water pixel, by the soil pixel. And that gives us this graph, which shows a spectral curve, also called a spectral fingerprint, because each material has a very specific way of interacting with light. And this is what allows us to identify the nature of this pixel, right, or of this material. Is this concept somewhat clear? I'm just trying to see. So this is obviously a two-dimensional image, and because the sensor has many bands, spectral bands, we actually end up with a image cube. So that's the third dimension. The third dimension is spectral information. And if we would, use or click on any pixel here and get all the values along the different bands for the same area on the ground, but different values, reflected light values, we can construct this graph. It shows the wavelengths or the bands, and then how much energy, solar energy, is being reflected. And you can see that it reflects here a lot in the green, and then less and less as we move to longer wavelengths. This is for a particular material. So that's what we call spectral resolution. And multispectral images such as Landsat, they have only a few bands, right? Hyperspectral sensors, they have hundreds of bands, and they're very narrow. They take measurements along the full spectrum, very narrow intervals, and provide a lot of detailed spectral information. And radiometric resolution refers to the sensitivity of the sensor, digital, basically the range of values they have to display the different energy levels or brightness levels. So the optical sensors, they operate in the optical portion of the spectrum, which is visible light and near infrared. In the case of multispectral, they will have only a few bands. You can see here, Worldview is a sensor. It's a commercial satellite, and it has its spectral bands here in the gray area. By the way, the gray, sort of gray area, is the visible light portion. So this would be ultraviolet, and this is near infrared here on this side. So Worldview has only a few bands. You can see that. There's another sensor that's a sensor called Venus, and it has also only few bands, but they're not recording the energy, continuously. They only have their spectral bands in very specific locations along the spectrum. And then NMAP is a hyperspectral sensor. It has many, many bands, and there are no gaps between the spectral bands, and they cover the entire visible light region. And this capability of detecting the different wavelengths is extremely important for what we call target detection, or the ability to detect certain type of material. Here we have, again, the wavelengths. No? The visible would be somewhere between 0.5 and 0.7 visible light, and then near infrared and mid infrared and so on. No? And the amount of reflectance. So basically, the returning signal, the signal that the sensor captures. And you can see that it's in percentage that most materials don't even reflect more than 50% of sunlight. So most materials reflect around 10 and 30% of sunlight. So it's you know, what happened to the rest of the light, the sunlight? Does anyone have an idea? You know, these materials, water, vegetation, and soil, they don't reflect so much sunlight in the visible. You know, most of them, not even 30, right? So what happens to the rest? What happened? Because the sun is the source of energy, so 100%, no, and only a portion of it is being reflected back to space. Well, the rest is being absorbed either by the atmosphere itself. The atmosphere also absorbs its heat. The atmosphere is actually responsible to keep the Earth's surface temperature sort of, consistent. So the atmosphere will absorb a lot of radiation, incoming radiation, and convert that into heat, just to keep the globe, the Earth, warm enough for life, life to happen. But then there are other portion of the spectrum where there's much more energy being reflected. No? Now our sensors. Sorry. Was there a question or not? Please feel free to interrupt me.
No, just
okay.
Unmute for the participant.
Okay. I don't know what this black. Can you see this line?
Yeah, someone make anonet, and I try to contact him to release the anonet, but still not.
Okay. Well, we got to live with it.
Yeah, because
right.
he wants to make a mark for himself, but he not realized that this can happen for all people in the screen.
Okay. All right. So anyway, so yeah, so you see that the Landsat is I think the satellite most people are familiar with, has its spectral bands listed here with these gray bars, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7, and it will only take six values, read 6 values, and with those 6 values, we can build this dashed line here. And what happens here is that it mimics the more detailed curve. This detailed curve was obtained with a hyperspectral sensor, right? Which has many bands and no gaps. But the Landsat sensor has gaps, as you can see here. So it's not taking any readings here. So what we do is we connect the points where it takes a reading, and then you get a line. So it's not as detailed as hyperspectral, but still shows the typical form, shape of soil, which has high reflectance here in the infrared. And this is why for rocks and soil, we rely on the infrared more than visible. We get more information here in this region. No? For vegetation, it's a little bit different. There's a peak here in the green wavelength, and that's why we see vegetation green, because we can only see the visible light. But it has much more, it reflects much more sunlight in the near infrared. And you can see that these curves, although they are similar, they're slightly different, and these slight differences, where they have peaks and where they have dips, allow us to identify what type of vegetation, because we can go with our spectrometer to the field, or we can collect certain vegetation types of plants and take them to the lab. And then with a spectrometer, we can illuminate that plant or the species and take a reading of how much light it absorbs or reflects and so on. And we can build these spectral signatures in the lab and then compare them with the spectral signatures obtained from the satellite, and then use them to actually label them or determine the nature of the plant. And we can do that also with other materials such as minerals. So here we have an example of a laboratory spectrum. This is a clay mineral, kaolinite, and you can see how detailed the curve is, the many measurements, hundreds of measurements, done in a lab under controlled, very much controlled conditions. We know the amount of energy shining over the sample and how much it reflects back and so on. We can measure all that. And we see that kaolinite, it has an important absorption feature right here at a very specific wavelength, and the same here and so on. And then compare that with a spectral signature obtained from Landsat. And of course, the Landsat has only 6 bands, right? Only 6 points compared to hundreds of points. But the curve, mimics the one in the lab, except that here, where you have a gap, Landsat misses this absorption feature. And this absorption feature always happens for kaolinite in the same spectral region. And this is why it's called a fingerprint. It's like taking fingerprints, There are specific regions in the spectrum where minerals have their absorption features. And it will change from one mineral type to the other. So quartz will have a different spectrum, a different spectral fingerprint. And this is what allows us to identify from space, basically far away, the type of rocks or the type of minerals, right? Of course, when the satellite takes an observation, that mineral or that rock type needs to be on the surface, cannot be, hidden by something. For example, by a forest. Then it needs to be exposed. And we can do the same with artificial materials. And here's an example of an urban area where they actually collected spectral signatures of different roof materials and were able to differentiate between PVC, tiles, concrete, zinc, bitumen, and so on, right? And this is why we often mention, or we often talk about remote sensing, especially hyperspectral remote sensing, as a way of material mapping, either natural materials or artificial materials. So one way of looking at remote sensing images is by interpreting the colors and the patterns. We see clearly this is a road. Why? Because we are familiar with the colors of the pavements and it's linear and so on. And we see that these are buildings. Why? Because they follow more or less geometric features. And along the roads, we see trees lining up, right? And so we do a visual interpretation. So this is one way of looking at images, by looking at the shapes of objects and so on. Another way is to get basically the spectral information from single pixels and display them in this way, and then compare these signatures to known spectral libraries where we have in the lab collected them and know what they are. So that's called target identification. So and a spectral image contains many types of information, the spatial information, the patterns and so on, but also the spectral. Now, at the end, the user, needs to, dealing with these graphs is not a very efficient way to do the mapping. It's good for identifying the nature of the individual objects, but at the end, we need a map like this, right? And here we have an image, and we need to convert this image into a map. And that requires that we collect what we call training sites. And these training sites are individual small areas where we know what they are, what they represent, and we use an algorithm or software to extract the spectral signature, basically to extract these different signatures, use these signatures to train the algorithm to find similar pixels somewhere else that have not been used for training, and then basically label all the pixels. So the output, the classified image output, the quality will depend on how well you trained the algorithm, how well you obtain these spectral signatures. So that's very important. Okay. Right. How much time do I have?
You still have some time. That's until half past 9, I think.
Okay. So with the slides that I just showed, I finished talking about the whole imaging system, right? And how it works, and the importance of the wavelength. The wavelength of any material contains a lot of information about the material. Now we're going to do a little bit of an image visualization exercise. All right. So I want you to look at the left and look at this picture here, which is called a true color composite, and then compare it to the right, which is called a false color composite. Why? Because in order for us to visualize any pictures on the screen, right, we need to use the 3 color channels of the monitor. And the 3 color channels of the monitor represent the primary colors: blue, green, and red, or red, green, and blue. No? So this is how our monitors, create all the different colors by using 3 primary colors. And that means that if we have an image cube like this, we need to select 3 different bands and associate them with the different color channels of our monitor, and create either a naturally looking landscape like this one, where we are very much familiar with the colors, green meaning vegetation, and this is probably a plowed field in yellow, and so on. If we select bands, spectral bands, wavelengths, that do not correspond, do not match the colors of the monitor, for example, band 1 corresponds, this is Landsat band 1, is in reality showing you the blue wavelength, but we are displaying the blue wavelength as red. And then we take the next one, which is, I think, green, and that's being assigned to green. And then band 3 would be red, and red is being assigned to the blue channel. And that's why we see the colors here distorted. But the advantage is often that by distorting a little bit the colors, basically looking at the same area but with these weird colors, we start seeing some more contrast. Here in this field that was harvested, we start seeing, you know, more variability, maybe more than here, right? But we lose variability in the crop field. So here we see much more variability, and here it's very dark, and we basically lose information, but we gain information in other fields. And that is done with any type of surface. So let's do an experiment. So here on the left, you see three bands, three spectral bands, and they are showing an area actually in Spain. And I briefly tell you what you're looking at. So this is a mountain, sort of a hilly area. You can see the texture. It's not flat. And in the middle, you see a dark spot. This is a water reservoir. So there's a dam somewhere here, and this is water. The black is water. And then there's a river. It's kind of difficult to see. And here we have fields, you know, agriculture. And this may be a road, this line here, right? And we're looking at the same area, but with using three different bands, spectral bands. And some of them are visible light, and one of them is near infrared. And you can see that the forested, by the way, the hilly area is forested. The forested area looks very dark here, less dark here, and relatively bright here. It's the same forest. It's just in this band, whatever spectral region it is, it's not reflecting a lot of sunlight. Whereas here in this band, the forest is reflecting a lot of sunlight, and that's why it looks bright. So bright means a lot of energy is being returned to the sensor. And we're going to assign these different spectral bands to colors. The color of your channels, right? Because we humans, we see better features if we look at them in color. We are much better in differentiating colors than gray tones. And the combination of these three bands give us this color composite, which is a false color composite. And now we're starting to see more features. All this information is contained here. We just couldn't see it very well. Now we see it much better because we see color contrast. And that's the principle of remote sensing, to enhance the image in such a way that we start seeing patterns. And you can see that vegetation actually is not shown in green. What you see in green is not, these are not crops or crop fields. What you see in green is probably soil, harvested soil. No? And in red is showing you vegetation. Dark red is the forest, the pine forest, and lighter red are the crop fields. And water is sort of dark blue. No? And what you see sort of in magenta purple, those are exposed soil. No? So this is the principle. Okay, so another example. I want you to look at this picture showing half of the African continent. And obviously what stands out are two types of colors. Sort of, you know, I don't know, grayish, greenish, pinkish, I don't know how to call this type of color. And then the reddish colors. So if you want, the colors are differentiating two very important landscape features. One is the Saharan desert, but even within the Saharan desert, we see some variations. We see some darker and some lighter areas. And we see patterns. I don't know if you see this pattern here. It's kind of sort of a round pattern, like streaks, right? So any idea what these darker spots may represent? They're also visible here along the Red Sea along the coast. So those are outcrops, mountain outcrops, basically rocks, but they are not vegetated. And they look dark on this false color composite. And the lighter colors are sand fields, dunes, and they're following the prevailing wind direction. The wind is blowing along, my cursor, right? And so the wind gets deposited following the prevailing wind direction and depending on the topography. And you can see that some basins are filled with a lot of sand, dunes, and higher altitude landscape features. They are not covered by sand at all, right? They're sand free. And that has to do with the speed of the wind and of course the topography. No? So only when the wind speed slows down, all the particles it carries can precipitate and accumulate on the surface. No? And more to the south, basically, we have a belt here, like a red belt here. This is the tropical rainforest. And it's looking red because the vegetated, area, which reflects a lot of light in near infrared, was displayed using the red channel of the monitor. So red means vegetation. But also it looks a little bit strange because there are no clouds. And in the rainforest, as you know, or in the tropical areas, it's almost, it's impossible to find, cloud-free skies. And this means that this picture here is actually composed of many pictures, mosaic. And it was the different scenes were selected based on how much cloud they contained. So it was carefully collected along a certain time period to build this mosaic showing a cloud-free tropical region. So the next exercise is looking at an optical image and a radar image of a section of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So this is an arid environment. No vegetated areas are shown. It's all showing, rocky areas. And the color composite here in the Landsat shows you clearly the different lithologies, right? And also the drainage patterns. I don't know if you can see that. The delta system. However, the drainage pattern stands out much better in the radar image. The radar usually doesn't have any color, but it's very sensitive to surface irregularities, whether the surface is very rough or smooth. It's the radar can pick up these variations, and it will highlight the drainage patterns much better, because usually the drainage channels in arid environments, they don't carry water year round. They're usually dry. They only carry water whenever there's a rainfall event, but a flash flood. But they look very smooth, the surface, because they're covered by these flash flood deposits, and that generates this dark color. And if we combine both, so basically the lithological information from Landsat or multispectral image with the textural information from the radar, we can build a fused image, a fused composite image. Here it's only showing the image within the drainage basin. So what we did is in the GIS, we overlaid the drainage basin boundary, and we extracted from both only the portions within the drainage basin. but you start seeing not only the colors, but also the texture. And these textural differences allow us to do a much better mapping. So we start actually identifying much more clearly the boundaries between the different the lithological units based on color, spectral color, and based on texture. You know? Because even within the, you know, the very rough mountain areas, you see some textural differences. This portion here, if you look at the texture, is different from this portion here and different from this portion here. So each one sort of shows different variations. No, some of these variations are due to topography, of course, but some also are associated with the type of lithology. No? So here we have different types of, you know, old granites, younger metamorphic rocks, and so on. No? And as you know, they, depending on the rock type, the erosion or erosive forms may vary. And so we take advantage of this by looking at radar and optical. And this one is just to show you also that with vegetation, we can do the same. Here we have the Nile Delta. This time we're looking at the true color composite. And the Nile itself, the river itself, cannot really be seen, right? But there's a section somewhere here where we see the river, the Nile River. And this is when we look at the Cairo. This gray area is Cairo. And here we can see the Nile. How come we can see the Nile here and not in the, you know, in the Nile Delta or in the valley? That has to do with the fact that the color contrast between the water and the vegetated, irrigated vegetation is not high enough for our eyes to pick it up. Whereas in the urban area, in Cairo, there is no vegetation. And the contrast between concrete, you know, urban materials and the river is high enough for us to see it. So contrast is very important. And then finally, a time series, and now we are in Saudi Arabia, and we're looking at again at the desert area, false color, because if you would fly over this area and you would look down from the airplane, you would not see these colors. You would see the entire area with one color, probably yellow, meaning sand. The fact that we can see colors is because this image was taken with showing spectral regions we cannot see. No? And those spectral regions, I mentioned that before, are shortwave infrared or infrared, and that's the region where soil and rocks have their very diagnostic features, or they can be differentiated much better. And so we also see a drainage pattern. So this is a depression here, and there is a bluish area. This is a lake, sabkha. They are called sabkhas. You know, and also a muddy area, and it's collecting water actually coming from the ground, you know, and through slowly but surely flowing into the depression, and then the water table you know, intercepts the ground surface, and you see water accumulation. But you also see some agriculture activities happening here, taking advantage of the near groundwater. Okay, so there's no surface water except when there's a flash flood, but the groundwater is quite close to the surface, and so farmers take advantage of that. So this picture is from 1987 or something like that. The next one was taken 4 years later. And you see a phenomenon happening here, more upland. Those round fields are also agricultural fields, but they are irrigated using a sophisticated irrigation system using groundwater, right? And now watch what's happening also to the lake, and the fields near the lakes are more relying on near surface water. So these are the round ones are relying on deep water, groundwater. A few years later, you see that the irrigated fields are expanding. But what's happening to the lake? The lake is drying out. Why is it drying out? Because there is not enough, groundwater flowing into the depression, and the water table is dropping because most of the water is being used for irrigation away from the depression, a little bit higher. And then eventually the lake dries out, and all the water that would normally flow into the depression is captured by these huge irrigation systems. And you can also see that the city, you see here in the middle, the city is expanding. All right, and this is my last example. And now we're back in United Arab Emirates, back in arid environment. And this is the picture taken during the night from, I think from the International Space station, from a picture taken by astronauts. And it shows you the outline of the Oman and UAE, and this area here is Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Sharjah is close to Dubai. It's also a big city, and you can see the highways, they are illuminated, right? And it's now a fact that most people are living now along the coast, right? And rapid urbanization is happening. And these cities, like this one, these used to be two cities, two separate cities 20, 30 years ago. And now it became one big city because they're growing and expanding. And that, of course, has implication in terms of land use and land cover changes, and it's causing a lot of environmental problems and the destruction of natural ecosystems. And the other aspect that is, also very serious and a problem is waste. What do we do with the waste, waste disposal? And in this example, we're going to do a mapping exercise to map a landfill within a city. Okay, so it's an urban area and it's Sharjah. This is a high resolution image. It's a commercial image, multispectral. And we see that's the outskirts of Sharjah. You see some industrial areas here. These are, buildings and so on. There is a sport field here, and the red indicates that this is false color. So red is showing you vegetation. And then in the middle, we have a landfill. And dark is the, basically the polluted water, and and all the waste. And we're trying to map this basically disturbed area. And you can see here the natural ecosystem consisted of dunes. These are dunes, right? They're being converted into urban area. And there's a lot of soil salinization also going on. So the first step is to take this image, use an algorithm that will sort of group patches of land that look spectrally similar. So if we look at this large patch here, it has basically one color. It's coming from this area here. So the algorithm is looking for any, region here that looks more or less homogeneous and is going to group those pixels. So here you have another one. Whereas here you have many small patches. Why? Because you can see also the texture, it's quite heterogeneous. No? So where it's very heterogeneous, it will, group only few pixels. But it does a quite good job basically converting the original image into a segmented, we call it a segmented image. And just to show you why this is segmented, so you're looking at the patches, color patches, but each patch can be outlined with a vector, and that's done here. So this is what the algorithm did. It went through the image and it started drawing boundaries. It drew boundary wherever there is a homogeneous spectrally. Now, not only texturally, but also spectrally. It uses both criteria. Texture, so the texture should be equal, and spectral information should also be within a range of variability. No? And it looks at shape, especially in the city and urban area and roads. So it uses several criteria to draw these segments. And once we have these segments, we can then label them. So here we're looking at one particular type of land cover, which is basically impervious surfaces or paved surfaces. And you can see that the street pattern comes out very nicely. But even in the landfill area, we see some confusion. So this is not paved, but the classifier was not able to differentiate between this patch here and the asphalt along the street. So there's some confusion, and I tell you why. Then the next one, we just, I'm showing just individual land cover types, is looking at vegetation, right? But it also found some vegetation in the landfill. Now, this could be due to it could be vegetation, could be algae or algae blooms or whatever, but I think it's probably another confusion that is happening. So it's not separating well the vegetated areas from some other spectral signature, which looks similar to vegetation, but is not vegetation. And this would be the polluted water, the brine. And this is the final map. So we used a very high resolution satellite, showing, it has, I think, 4 meter pixel, 4 meter, each pixel is 4 by 4 meter. And it has 4 bands, spectral bands, which is not a lot. It doesn't have enough spectral information to avoid confusion, because you see the buildings, red are showing buildings, and we know there are no buildings here. But the material that we found here may be building material or similar to building material. And that's why you end up with buildings being shown in the landfill, although this is not, a building, right? Now, with hyperspectral sensor, we have many more spectral information, and you can see that here in these graphs. Remember, you can do something called material mapping, and we did that with, that's a spaceborne hyperspectral sensor, Hyperion. It no longer works. And so we mapped the same area. The previous slide was looking only at this part here. Now this sensor doesn't have a 4 by 4 meter resolution. It has a 30 by 30 meter resolution, and that's why you cannot zoom in very much, because it doesn't have the spatial resolution. But you see the landfill, you see the runway, and so on. But we were able to obtain very detailed spectral signatures for all these different materials, vegetation, asphalt, building, dark building, light, sand, and water, and so on. And you can see that less confusion occurs. However, the spatial resolution is not good enough to give you a more detailed map like this one here. But this one has the problem that it doesn't have enough spectral information, and there's a lot of class confusion. All right, my final remarks basically are listed here. So in remote sensing, we can combine many types of data, hyperspectral data, which has many spectral bands with high resolution images, which have more spatial information. And by combining both, we obtain much more detailed picture of the land surface or surface materials. We can also combine optical data with microwave or radar, as I did the example I gave in Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. There are many types of classifiers. The one that I just showed is the object-based classification. Okay, there's someone who raised a hand. Please go ahead, and can someone tell me what the question is?
Yeah, Professor Magaly, there are a lot of questions from the audience. Yeah, I already note 7 people.
Okay.
Also, this is another one, so 8 people. And I will give a chance for the first attendant who has a question to you. So, Mr. Udi from Lapan, he has a question for you. Please, Mr. Udi, you can ask directly to Professor Magaly.
Or maybe shall I finish this slide first? Is this my last slide?
Okay.
So yeah, I was talking about classification methods. So the one I just showed is called the object-based classification, which extracts feature information from very high resolution images, such as Econos, QuickBird, Worldview 2, and so on. And but if you want to improve the classification result, it would definitely be better if you have access to high spatial and high spectral resolution images. Now, high spectral resolution images are currently not available from space, but there will be a mission soon to be launched into space, I think in 2021, NMAP, which will provide hyperspectral space images at 30 by 30 meter pixel resolution, and it's going to be much much better sensor than Hyperion. Hyperion was launched 20 years ago, and it stopped working, I think 5 years ago, or maybe longer, I don't know. And so, of course, the new satellite mission will carry much more advanced technology. So, although the pixel size is still relatively coarse, but the radiometric resolution and spectral resolution will be very high. So we're waiting for that satellite to become available, and it's going to be freely available. It's being, constructed and actually and managed by the German Space Agency. And so spatial information is good for discriminating the shapes and boundaries of features, and produce spatial inventory of the urban landscape or any other landscape. But the spectral information is the one that allows us to detect the type of material, basically enables us to do what we call surface material mapping, to identify the nature of the material and its physical and chemical composition. Okay, so that was my last slide. And so I'm going to take some question, and hopefully, I don't know if there's time left later, but I wanted to point out at least one website here. So if once we finish with the question and answers, maybe there are 5 or 10 minutes to look at this website. So please go ahead with the questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Magaly, for a very nice, very interesting topic for your presentation. Now we have 30 minutes for the discussion. There are several questions, yeah, from the attendants. So for the first, I will give.
Shall I stop sharing for now?
No, no problem. I think no problem. You can still on.
So that I can see also the, people and the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. From Mr. Udi. So you have a chance first to make a question.
Or maybe you can read the questions in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I will read some question later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for the opportunity for the question. I think this is a great opportunity to be able to get knowledge sharing from Professor Magaly. Thank you. At this time, in the current pandemic, COVID pandemic, I think it's difficult for us to conduct a geological survey, especially in Indonesia, where the COVID chart is always increasing every day. And I think remote sensing will have a big role in spatial geological investigation. But the challenge is, we know that Indonesia, as a tropical country, have very thick vegetation cover, or maybe soil cover. Do you have any suggestion for geological mapping or investigation using remote sensing in vegetated area? And based on your experience, what is the accuracy of geological investigation if we use remote sensing data with minimum ground check, or maybe if we don't have any data without ground check data? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first part, vegetated areas are difficult to map. I mean, in terms of geology and so on. What you can do is map landforms, right? But lithology is going to be tricky because unless it's free of vegetation, it's going to be very hard. And even when it's free of vegetation, like in arid environments, what you detect actually on the satellite is not the fresh rock, it's the weathering product. And in arid environments, we have the problem of the sand. It's not even in situ, it's transported material, deposited. It's covering, right? It's covering the bedrock, it's covering the outcrop, right? So it's so if you want, in arid environment, we have the same problem. It's not the vegetation that is obstructing the view of what's under it. It's the sand fields, dunes. They're totally, we cannot see any structures because there are huge sand dunes on top of it, right? So we have to apply an indirect method. And that's why geomorphology plays such a big role in remote sensing. So we analyze the landforms. We analyze, and by the way, not only with satellite images, but also with the digital elevation models, both together. And data fusion is very important. So we look at the area actually using different wave length or spectral regions. You know that radar can penetrate, some type of radar can penetrate the canopy, but it doesn't really show you the lithology, right? But at least it can show you the land surface, the topography under the canopy. And the more information you get about the landforms, the more you can and the landscape and the relief and the texture, the more indirect clues you obtain about the type of rock or formation. If you remember, I said that for Sinai Peninsula, the basin we were mapping, we used optical and radar, and we looked at not only at the color or spectral information, but also the texture, the drainage, even the drainage pattern tells you something about the rocks, right? And so, yeah, indirect clues about the landscape and the patterns. So that's one way. And but in Indonesia, you have a lot of, you know, the topography is quite varied, and I think that's another criteria you can use, no? And then using different types of you know, regions in the spectrum.
Yeah. Okay.
And was there another part of the question? I don't know if I missed something.
Okay, Mr. Udi, is it enough for the?
Okay.
Yes. Maybe because a lot of question, I will read for you was the private message from Mrs. Devina. She is a young lecturer in our department. She has some questions related to your presentation. I will read for her. So she said that some people understand remote sensing and photogrammetry are two different things. In her knowledge, is that photogrammetry and remote sensing are the same methods of recognizing object as not touching object. So what do you think? Is photogrammetry and remote sensing are two different things, or maybe you can have any idea about this?
Yeah, well, you know, the term remote sensing applies to many survey methods, not only the one that I, you know, described today. Any geophysical, basically, method that relies on detecting some force or energy from the distance, doesn't have to be radiation. Gravity, for example, it could be a sonar, you know, sounders, or is classified or can be referred to as remote sensing. No, so the term itself, you know, encloses many forms of surveys, and photogrammetry definitely is remote sensing. No, it's just that I think because it has become so popular, the, you know, this satellite based remote sensing, that when you use this term, automatically most people think of satellite sensors, but it's, yeah, definitely. And photogrammetry, you know, is actually I believe it's more focused on restoring basically the image, or not the image, um, the land surface, you know, getting rid of distortions and basically coming up with a map, right, of the land surface, or the picture showing the land surface, which is distortionless, right? And you also use photogrammetry to extract, for example, a digital elevation model, you know? And so it's more, I think, focused on generating yeah, an author rectified image, right, distortionless and so on. Whereas in satellite remote sensing, we have now so many different sub fields, you know, those that deal with the radar, which is a completely different field from optical, and they're more concerned, I think, also concerned about generating an output that is distortionless, but more about extracting properties, land surface properties, such as physical quantities of the land surface, right? And not only looking at the shape of land surfaces, but, you know, I think that's a little bit a different angle. No?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a second question. Will the spectral signature value of an object change depending on the climate of an area? Because earlier you said that this spectral value is also influenced by the energy emitted by the object, where we know that the energy emitted by the object and received by the sensor can also disturb by noise.
Yeah, is that referring to the signal to noise
Yeah.
ratio? Okay.
Will the spectral signature value of an object change depending on the climate of an area?
Okay, climate of an area. I think it's more. I think maybe I was referring to the atmospheric composition at the time of imaging. No, because the sun rays, they have to pass the atmosphere twice on their journey from the sun to the Earth's surface, and then from the Earth's surface back to space. So twice these sun rays need to pass the atmosphere, which is 10 kilometers thick, or I don't know how many kilometers. And the atmosphere is not empty. It contains not only gas molecules, it contains dust, it contains all kinds of particles, and they will also interact with the energy, and they will transform that. They will change the spectral information. So that's why these images need to be corrected, atmospherically corrected, no? And of course, the climate plays a role, because if you are imaging an area where the atmosphere is very homogeneous, let's say very homogeneous atmosphere, and not many clouds, and not a lot of vapor. Vapor actually is a big problem in remote sensing, water vapor, because water vapor absorbs energy, you know.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at one of those areas, regions with the climate where, you know, there are not many clouds and so on, of course, and it's the signal that the sensor receives is going to be less distorted. Whereas in tropical environments, clouds are a big problem. But not only clouds, also haze and water vapor in general. And of course, pollution, for example, in big cities, pollution is a big problem for remote sensing. Air pollution. Because, I mean, if you want to detect air pollution, then that's you will use a sensor that only detects that, no? But if you want to detect what's under the air pollution on the ground, you have to deal first with with whatever is above the ground.
Okay, thank you for your answering. And then I will read for another question from Mr. Rahmat Darmawan from Diponegoro University too. Which one is worth to use, satellite-based or ground-based, in terms of effectiveness for mining sector?
So which one is used for what?
For effectiveness for mining sector, which one is the best, satellite-based or ground-based?
Drone-based, okay, okay. For mining activities?
Yes, for mining activity.
Okay, so in general, the platform that you're going to use, whether it's a ground-based platform, could be a tower or a crane or something, or a truck, I don't know, or the drone or the aircraft or the satellite. That platform, the selection of the platform will depend on the size of your study area and how much detail you need. So if it's a mining area and it's not very large, and yes, so I would go with drones, right? However, there's a problem with drones and also with ground-based remote sensing instruments, is that you don't have the repetition cycle that you have with other platforms, not even with aircraft. Because for an aircraft to fly over an area, you need to hire a pilot, you need to hire an aircraft, and that's very costly. And even with the drones. Whereas satellites, they're constantly constantly imaging the Earth's surface.
Okay.
So, of course, the detail, the amount of detail is less unless you go with commercial satellites, but they're costly.
Yeah.
But you have that temporal resolution. So
Okay.
it depends what your study is about.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Another question from Mr. Erlanga. Is there any guideline for interpreting satellite image from international institution or others?
Is there any what?
Is there any guidelines? Yeah,
Guideline.
yeah,
Okay.
for interpreting satellite images from international institution or others?
Yes, this is why I wanted to, let me share my screen. Share this slide here.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely I would suggest that you looked up the fundamentals of remote sensing. This is a tutorial, and it was put together by the Canadian Center for Remote Sensing. No? And it's been around for quite a long time, but it's still, you know, being used. And it's very extensive, and this is actually a PDF file, so you can download it. No,
Okay.
so yes, so I recommend that you look into this. And then this one is also that's the America View. It's a non-profit organization, and here I'm pointing at the remote sensing, you know, imagery game. But let me see if I can do this, and hopefully it will bring it up. Maybe not. But it contains also other useful information and guidelines and so on. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the information. Another question from Mr. Hamsahas. He has a question about is it possible for the satellite to detect what is below the Earth's surface?
Yeah, well, there are certain satellites that are designed to do that. And one of them is you may have heard about GRACE. It's actually a twin satellite mission or system, and it collects information about the gravitational pull. No, that you know that is responsible for the satellites when they pass over a very dense, you know, area like a, you know, continental area, and the spacecrafts are being pulled a little bit further, closer to the Earth, right, than when they're flying over an ocean basin, right? And these differences in gravitational force, no, very slight differences, can be translated into what we call terrestrial water content, or basically mass, right? How dense the mass is. And so this is a mission that is used for mapping, but very, very large areas, aquifer systems. So like the Saharan aquifer system. So for smaller scale aquifers, it's not possible yet.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Another question from Miss Anis. She has a question about what type of satellite images are best for the surface lithologic mapping.
Yeah, so again, it depends on the region, no? Tropical versus maybe, and even polar region. In polar region, you have the problem of ice and snow covering, you know, your land surface, right? For example, Greenland, no? I mean, we are very much interested in mapping what's under the ice fields, no? So microwave is one. So we tend to think of spectral regions first, and then we select the sensor or the type. So, for example, if you wanna map what's under the ice fields in Greenland, chances are you go with microwave radiation, because we know that it can penetrate dry snow and ice, no, a little bit. And then you need to ask yourself, the next question is, okay, how much resolution, spatial resolution do I need? Do I want to cover the entire Greenland area or just a tiny bit, right? So the resolution, once you decide which wavelength is most appropriate for your task,
Yeah.
then you need to decide on the scale, and that will determine whether you go with a satellite or airborne.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, because we will have full mapping, and for the students who just start learning remote sensing, what software can be used for satellite image processing?
Yeah, I recommend to go to the European Space Agency site, ESA, and they have a variety of public domain software. And so if you type European Space Agency, or the acronym ESA,
ESA. Yeah.
and then toolbox,
Okay.
or remote sensing toolbox, or something like that.
Okay.
Just do a Google search, and it will take you to a variety of software which are freely available. So
Okay.
this is one source. And the other one is for those who do GIS, QGIS. Are you familiar with QGIS?
QGIS. Yeah.
Yeah, QGIS.
Yeah.
QGIS.
Quantum GIS.
Yes, quantum QGIS.
Yeah.
There are some plugins. So you download the software, it's open.
Yeah.
And then there are some plugins, and there's one called SCP. S like SCP.
Yes.
And semi-automated classification, whatever, I don't know.
Okay.
SCP, and that's a plugin, and that allows you to do some processing, spectral
Processing spectrum.
and it's also freely
Okay.
available.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Another question from Miss Fania. How can we use that passive satellite when it is dark? As you know that those satellites cannot radiating their own radiation.
Yes. So what happens is with those that are passive, like Landsat, they actually have one spectral band which can collect information, which is the thermal, because thermal radiation is you can collect it during the night and during the day. Or Aster. I don't know if you're familiar with Aster.
Aster from Japan?
ASTER.
Yeah, from Japan.
Aster has thermal bands, many thermal bands, during night and day. But oftentimes for the visible light and near infrared, we only use the information collected during the when they pass, when they cross, when they orbit on the sunlit side of the Earth.
Okay. Thank you. Is it also from our student, from Miss Lydia? She has a question. Is there any possibility to use remote sensing for the area of structural geology mainly occur in that area? Is there any possible?
You mean detecting structural, geological structures? Yeah, I was going to in later lecture talk about that a little bit more in detail. So yes, so structures can be mapped also indirectly by mapping vegetation, believe it or not. Yeah, so we look at vegetation as it maybe mimics the falls, because they may, certain plants or trees may grow better within the fault zone than outside, because the fault zone carries more moisture or whatever. So you look at indirect clues in the landscape to basically try to detect these lineaments. Yeah, we will talk about lineaments later.
Okay, thank you. And from Mr. Aska, he has a question about what kind of development or improvement do you think will happen, or that you want it to happen to remote sensing instrument or technology in the future?
Yeah, well, one general problem is what's called the signal to noise ratio.
Noise ratio.
Yeah, so the instrument itself also generates signal,
Yeah.
believe it or not. And a lot of research is going into improving that. So basically, you know, you're collecting a signal that comes from many sources, not only from the target, but also from the atmosphere and from the instrument itself. So
Okay.
there are many, you know, random noise. And the separation of the signal, the true signal from all the rest is something that requires processing. And I think we are looking into better instruments nowadays, no, because
Okay.
the technology is improving. So that's at the instrument level. Now, the algorithms, I mean, we have come a long way
Okay.
to actually using now machine learning algorithms that enable us to do much better classifications than in the past.
Okay, because we still have time, there's still several questions.
Mhm.
From Mr. Keika, he asks about why are experts tend to use Sentinel-1 data and process it using differential insert rather than using Sentinel-2 data and process it using permanent scatter insert.
But Sentinel-1 is radar and Sentinel-2 is optical. It's multispectral.
Okay. Okay,
No?
yeah.
Yeah, the European Space Agency has this program, Sentinel, and there are Sentinel-1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. And each one, remember when I showed you the slide with the many satellites in the orbits, and I said that it's actually a constellation of satellites, but each satellite from the Sentinel series carries its own instrument looking at very specific portions of the spectrum. So, you know, you need to, and also it's also application dependent. So certain Sentinel, I think Sentinel-5 is meant for ocean mapping. And the Sentinel-2 is the optical one, which is similar to Landsat, more appropriate for coastal zones and land and so on. So it depends what the type of, you know, sensor they're using.
Okay, okay, thank you. From Miss Laurencia, she has a question about if we look at from the improvement of the remote sensing right now, yeah, do we still need to do related to the ground-based measurement?
Can you repeat it again? Sorry, I
Yeah,
was distracted here.
yeah, related to the improvement of the remote sensing, yeah. Yeah,
Yes,
he asks about do we still need to do ground-based measurement?
clone-based
Yeah,
measurement.
ground-based, yeah, ground-based.
Ground-based. Okay, so sorry. Ground-based measurement. Yes, yes, very important. Ground-based measurements, they are always needed because these instruments, they need to be calibrated. It's like, you know, and also you need to check whether they're still working correctly.
Okay.
It's not like, you know, you launch them and then you forget about them. No, you need to constantly monitor. No?
Okay. Yeah, another question from Mr. Imsak. Can satellite remote sensing get or provide some data to analyze energy from fuel oil?
To provide information about
Yes.
energy from
Yeah.
fuel oil.
Yeah. From
So are you talking about the, I'm not 100% sure how to understand this question. So fuel, is that energy being consumed at the house level or energy being obtained from an oil field or
the
what?
oil field. For the oil field.
Okay, okay. So I think that oil fields, there are being monitored using satellite images just to know where they are. And then also you can detect the gas flare, that when you're extracting oil, there's always a leftover that needs to be burnt, right? And they do that with these gas flares, and those can be mapped. There are some images that actually show this, but I don't know if we have time. I can. This is one of the websites I wanted to show you, but I'm not sure how we are running with time.
I think until
We're almost over, no?
past 10, yeah, quarter past 10.
Yeah. Maybe next time.
Maybe next time, I think, because
Maybe
a lot of
next time.
still a lot of question from our students here. Yeah. Okay, and there's also a question from our alumni from Tava. He asked about is there any specific rule or method to determine the best composite pen in false color for any particular thing? For instance, if we are looking for clay mineral, how we determine the pen used?
Right. The best way is to look at the spectral signature of clay minerals first, and then see where along the spectrum they have peaks or maybe the opposite of a peak, basically a dip. And then use spectral bands which highlight this contrast. So certain wavelengths, they may reflect a lot of light, and in others, they may not reflect light at all. And use contrasting regions of the spectrum to build the false color composite. That's done in vegetation. So vegetation, usually you use the red wavelength. Why? Because vegetation absorbs red. And then you use the near infrared because it reflects a lot. And then you use another band, so 3 bands to build. This is what I wanted to show with that first link, but we don't have time. So.
Yeah. Okay. Another question from Mr. Diko about could you explain some of sufficient data that we can extract using remote sensing data, for example, from the Lancet egg in the case for landslide assessment?
In the case for land assessment?
Landslide.
Oh,
assessment.
landslide. Sorry. Landslide are usually phenomenon that happened within a certain time, no? And so I would say the best way is to use a method that is called change detection. So before the landslide occurred, you try to find an image before it occurred, and then after it occurred, and then compare both images and do what's called change detection.
Okay.
And that will give you the extent of the landslides and also which areas were affected.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
Change detection, yeah.
Change detection. Okay. Another question from Mr. Garindra. He asks about how to differentiate rock types that has almost same characteristic using satellite imagery interpretation.
Yes. Yeah. So some rock types, they look very similar.
Yeah.
Also along the spectrum.
Yeah.
And that's when hyperspectral sensors are become so important, because for certain rock types, their absorption features happen in very, very narrow spectral bands. And if you don't have a sensor that has a band in that position along the spectrum, then you miss it. So yes, so for mineral mapping and rock mapping, hyperspectral sensors are the best. And as I said, there's this German mission that is hopefully going to be launched in 2021. NMAP, I recommend, if you want to learn more about it, go to ENMAP.
Okay.
Yes, and learn about that. Yeah, so.
Okay. Yeah. for last question. This is last question from the audience here. From Miss Risky. She asks about based on your explained in slide spectral imaging system, we have 7 bands, yeah, that describe the difference in wavelength. And the question is, in geology, which band may be used for geological analysis, and how do we process existing bands?
Yeah, so yeah, Landsat has seven bands.
Yeah.
Sentinel-2 has, by the way, more bands. So the newer satellites, there are now usually have more bands. Now the thing is that for geology is that you need the bands to be in a very specific place. And this is why the Aster, which is the sensor that I was referring before, it's an old sensor, and it had many spectral bands in the shortwave infrared and thermal infrared, which was excellent for geological application. But yeah, so again, I think this is similar to the last question. Hyperspectral sensors would be the best, no? And especially if you don't have access to hyperspectral sensors, those sensors that have what's called shortwave infrared. So it's after near infrared comes shortwave infrared in those regions. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have all questions, and I will wrap up for this guest lecture meeting. That okay, and based on the remote sensing, yeah, we can now do for another way in the pandemic that we can use satellite measurement, satellite product, and also in terms of environmental application, yeah, we can use this remote sensing. That's very valuable for us, as usually we have still use a conservative, we can only for the mapping, but now we have a new tools or new equipment or to new improvement to do for mapping, not only by ground-based checking on ground-based measurement. Yeah, thank you so much for Professor Magaly. And there is yeah, some asking to you to please share for your first slide to do some photo. Yeah, because we need to yeah, for the first slide. Yeah, for the first slide we can share again, and the committee will make a photo.
Okay, so I should share my slides.
Yeah, for your cover or the first slide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the committee will take a picture for this. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, for the first page.
Let me do it this way. Easy.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
This one here. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, for the full screen like this. Okay. Yes. Okay. Mr. Reddy, you can get a picture for this, or maybe also for the attendants can open the video, or
I think the first slide is enough, sir.
Okay.
Wait a minute, second.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, done. Thank you.
Okay. Do we need some photo session together with all attendants? Can open the video?
The video?
It's okay. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. For the attendants or for the all participants, please now turn on your video so we can make a photo session together.
Okay. Shall I still share my screen?
Yeah. You can stop your share screen. Thank you. Professor Magaly, you can stop your share screen, I think.
I can stop? Okay.
Yeah, you can stop. Yeah, okay. Then for all participants, I hope you can turn on your video so we will have a photo session together for this valuable moment with the professor from Boston University? Yes, I think.
Right, now I see them.
Yes, a lot of
Yeah.
student from Diponegoro University and also guests from also colleague from Papua. So you, Mr. David Victor, also from Lapan, Mr. Udi. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
nice to see all these. Very nice to see all these faces.
Yeah, yeah. So okay, I think Mr. Reddy, you can have a chance to get a picture for whole participant and also for whole.
1 more minute, sir.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Ooh. Okay.
Okay.
Very good. Yes.
Okay. From one page to another page of the figures.
Yes.
Already finished?
Already finished.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah. Professor Magaly, on behalf of the committee from the Geological Engineering Department, we would say very, very thank you for your very nice presentation, excellent presentation today, and give our students a chance, or our alumni, or also our relative here to do for the remote sensing analysis when we have some difficulty in the direct measurement, yeah, direct measurement in the field, so we can practice this remote sensing. And I hope or we hope that you still have a chance, or you still have a time for us, yeah, for us to do some another lecture in the future.
I think so. The next one, I think, is next week, no?
Yes, yes. Okay, I think my duty as a moderator, I finish, and I will give to the host for, I don't know, maybe for the closing remark or something. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Magaly, for your time. I think we can close this meeting for tonight. Thank you very much, Ms. Magaly, Pak Thomas, and for all participants, we can close this meeting right now. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Hello, ma'am. Can I?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you, ma'am.